Welcome to the War Watch podcast, a 6-episode series from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, a joint centre of the University of Geneva and the Geneva Graduate Institute.
Hello and welcome to the War Watch podcast. I'm your host, Juliet Graf, and today we will be talking about the conflict in Iran, and in particular, what it has meant for civilians caught between a regime that was already killing its own people, a war launched from outside, and an aftermath in which the repression has only intensified. So just a quick note before we begin. We are recording this the 11th of May 2026. The ceasefire brokered by Pakistan on April 8th is holding. It's fragile, it's repeatedly violated, and it's far from settled. Diplomacy is ongoing, but so are the executions inside Iran, and we'll come back to that in a bit. I'm joined, as always, by Stuart Casey-Maslen, who is the head of the War Watch project here at the Geneva Academy and one of the world's leading experts in international humanitarian law. And we're very excited to have Shima Esmailian joining us for this episode. Shima is actually one of our teaching assistants here at the Geneva Academy, and she's also a PhD candidate at the University of Geneva, where she researches international law and gender. She did her earlier studies in law in Iran at Shahid Beheshti University in Tehran. Shima, thank you so much for being with us today. So to understand what this conflict has meant for ordinary Iranians, we have to go back before February 28th. So Iran has lived through 5 major waves of mass protests over the past 2 decades. We've had 2009, 2017, 2019, 2022, and then 2025 into 2026. There's been different triggers each time: a contested election, economic collapse, the death of Mahsa Jina Amini in police custody, which triggered the Women Life Freedom movement, and most recently, the collapse of the national currency. But inherently, there's been the same demand underneath all of them: an end to a regime that was built on repression. And each time, these protests were met with similar response. But so what happened in January 2026 was different in scale. And of course, there was the internet shutdown that accompanied the crackdown, and it was the longest and most severe the Iranian regime has ever imposed. So Shima, you were outside Iran when January happened. What do you remember of those days?
What stays with me most is the last images that I saw from Iran before the blackout on 8 January. My friends preparing to join the protest, they were posting on social media saying that they were heading into the streets. The protest had already begun, particularly among the shopkeepers in the Grand Bazaar, the bazaris in Farsi, which historically have held significant political significance in Iran. But that evening, there was also a public call from the opposition figures outside the country for people to mobilize. The main call came from the late Shah's son, yet many of those who responded were not monarchists. For many people, this was yet another opportunity to openly and collectively reject the regime. The last images that I saw that evening was extraordinarily large crowds on the street, and then almost immediately the internet was shut down and there was complete silence. Then the following morning, a small number of images began to emerge, likely transmitted through Starlink. And then they showed dozens of people lying in the street. The regime had launched a violent crackdown against protesters and used lethal force, and the violence didn't stop there. Security forces entered hospitals and even killed wounded protesters receiving treatment. The scale of violence was immediately apparent to me. Seeing those images, I understood that the number of casualties would likely reach into the thousands, and sadly, it did. The following was a succession of deeply traumatic images and testimonies. Credible human rights NGOs verified more than 7,000 deaths, with some estimates considerably higher. For instance, the UN Special Rapporteur on Iran said that the number of victims could reach into tens of thousands, even though it's it remains impossible really to reach to a definitive number. Even under ordinary circumstances, it is difficult to document and verify atrocities in Iran because of the state intimidation and also restriction on access. But with the internet shutdown, the independent verification really became nearly impossible in this case. But what we know is that this was among the most severe crackdowns by a government against its own population in recent history. And then what it was followed was sweeping arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, bans on public gatherings, attacks against families of the victims, and the intense militarization imposed by the regime in the aftermath of protest. Some NGOs said that more than 53,000 arrests happened around that time. A few days later, I briefly managed to speak to a friend inside Iran after communication partially resumed. He told me that in my hometown, Esfahan, the number of deaths had exceeded the capacity of the morgues. So bodies were being stored in the refrigerated facilities at the central food and vegetable market outside, and while families were searching for hours trying to find and locate their beloved ones. I can only describe this as horrific. I think people have lived through many different violences in the past few years, but this felt appalling in a different way. A friend wrote to me saying that they felt they were living through apocalyptic times and no longer recognized the country they lived in.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Shima. I think it's so important that we hear it also in that way and not through, just through statistics alone. And so, as we said, the Security Council met, the Human Rights Council had an emergency session, and yet there seems to be nothing concrete that came out of it for civilians on the ground. How did you experience that failure, and what did it open the door to?
In fact, the massacre took place during the weekend, while much of Europe and the wider international community were still effectively in holiday mode. That combined with internet shutdowns, the full scale of the killings only became known days later. And the UN Security Council and the Human Rights Council convened emergency and special sessions later in January, but ultimately these meetings didn't result in concrete protective measures for civilians on the ground, and also some states even invoked the principle of sovereignty or non-interference with internal affairs. But at the same time, we saw that this trauma and frustration generated by the massacre began to be politically instrumentalized, especially by US and the United States, and even part of the Iranian opposition increasingly framed external military intervention as the only remaining solution. So even some actors even invoked the responsibility to protect, the R2P principle, to argue that war could serve as a legitimate pathway to liberating the Iranian people. And unfortunately, the war started.
Stuart, let's turn to you. So when a government kills its own protesters on that scale, what does international law actually require in that situation? What framework should have been applied, and where did it fall short?
There are two frameworks that apply to the situation in Iran. First and foremost, of course, it's international human rights law. There was no armed conflict at the time of the attacks. And while we obviously think instinctively of the right to freedom of peaceful assembly, which can only be limited on certain grounds, and certainly not peaceful protest against the regime in power, more generally, it's of course the rights to life and the right to freedom from ill treatment. Those two are front and centre in the protection of the protesters. But given the scale, given the systematic and widespread nature of the attack, we're also talking here about international crimes, in particular crimes against humanity, of murder, of persecution, of arbitrary deprivation of liberty. And I think it is in both those frameworks that we need to look for some measure of accountability. Of course, Iran is not a state party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, but the Security Council could and should have referred the situation to the court. That did not happen. I would assume that is now unlikely, at least in the immediate future. But both of those frameworks, the violation, the systematic, widespread violation of human rights, and the commission of widespread crimes against humanity, both of those frameworks are applicable.
And so by the time the first strikes landed on February 28th, the Iranian civilians were already living under a government that had just killed thousands of its own people. And now they were caught in what we call an international armed conflict. So when that happens, a different body of law is supposed to kick in, international humanitarian law, the laws of war. So let's look at what that law required of all parties and whether it was respected. So before we get into specific cases that we've chosen to focus on for the sake of this episode, we do have to name what happened on the very first day. A school in Minab was hit, 175 people were killed. Most of them were young girls between 7 and 12 years old. So a U.S. military assessment found its forces were likely responsible using outdated targeting data. So we're not going to dwell on it in this episode because it has been extensively reported, and the human reality of it doesn't really need our elaboration, but it cannot go unnamed. And so what we want to do now is look more closely at two cases that have received far less attention, but do raise equally serious and alarming questions. So our War Watch portal has documented several alarming patterns, including strikes on more than 30 universities across Iran. Isfahan University of Technology was hit twice. One of the engineering professors there was killed alongside his family. There's Sharif University, which is sometimes described as the MIT of Iran, that was also struck. The Shahid Beheshti University in Tehran, the Pasteur Institute. These universities are not military installations. So, Stuart, you researched and wrote the War Watch entry for Iran. And so could you tell us a bit more about these attacks? What does international humanitarian law say about all of this? What would it actually take for these strikes to be legal? Like, what is the attacking party obliged to establish before striking a civilian institution like this?
I think firstly, before we attack the issue of international humanitarian law and its application to those incidents, we need to reiterate that this was a war of aggression. This was a serious violation of jus ad bellum, that's the law on interstate use of force by Israel and the United States against Iran, and we need to put that down very clearly. Of course, IHL applies in parallel and separate from jus ad bellum, and the incidents you describe raise very serious concern about possible war crimes. You are only entitled, indeed you are required by IHL, to target military objectives. That is an object that may be military by nature, most obviously aircraft, weapons and so on, or by their use. So if there is evidence that these universities were being used, for example, to store weapons or used as command and control for the military, then that part of the university would be a lawful military target. We've heard, or at least I have heard, no evidence that that was the case. And this looks more like a cultural war than it does a war in accordance with IHL. Of course, with all these incidents, we need an investigation, we need an inquiry, but that must not be swept under the table. Once this war is hopefully over, we need an investigation into all the attacks by Iran, by Israel, by the United States to assure ourselves what was in compliance with IHL and what was a violation of the law. And sadly, I think we've got a lot in that second column.
And Shima, perhaps you could tell us a bit of what this means for Iranian society to lose so many of its universities in that way, not just the buildings, but what does it do to a generation? What does it do to a country?
Two of the universities that you mentioned are places where I studied myself, so this issue is deeply personal to me. It is heartbreaking and also brings back mixed feelings. On the one hand, I experienced harassment there for not complying with mandatory hijab rules. But at the same time, those institutions gave me the intellectual tools and critical thinking that later enabled me to resist the system. And I think that contradiction says a great deal about Iran itself. Iran is in many ways a society full of contradictions. And despite internal repression and corruption, as well as sanctions and political isolation from abroad, Iranian universities have contributed to produce exceptional students, professionals, researchers who contribute globally to science, medicine, technology, and academia. The same is true for the Pasteur Institute. It's one of the oldest and most respected public health and research institution in the Middle East, and had historical role in vaccine developments, infectious disease research, and public health. So for me, targeting these universities, hospitals, healthcare systems, as well as in general the infrastructure that are indispensable to civilian life, we saw attacks on the bridges, the rail infrastructures, the petrochemical hubs. All of these, to me, they are not isolated or accidental. I see them as part of a broader attack on knowledge, daily life, and ultimately on the foundations of civilian itself. We heard Trump stating bluntly that he wanted to return Iran to the Stone Age, and that he said that the civilization could die overnight. So I think despite decades of both internal repression and external pressure, Iranian society continued to survive and even thrive. And I think targeting this institution feels less like an attempt to weaken the state and more like an effort to damage the foundations of society itself.
And another kind of strike that we've been documenting through War Watch is the attacks on water infrastructure. So desalination plants, water treatment facilities, power grids. It's important to note that Iran was already experiencing one of the worst water crises in its history before a single bomb fell. And then on April 2nd, after this primetime address from Trump threatening to bomb Iran back to the Stone Ages, as you just said, Shima, the U.S. forces actually attacked the B-1 bridge near Tehran. So this was the first direct strike on civilian transport and economic infrastructure. So, Stuart, IHL has something very specific to say about this category of target. Can you explain this protection that exists for infrastructure that civilians depend on to survive, and how you would assess what we saw here?
So ordinarily, water infrastructure, water itself, is a civilian object. That means it's protected from attack. That means that it may not be the victim of an indiscriminate attack. Everything must be targeted against military objectives. The United States has a very broad understanding of what is a military objective, and they include what they call war-sustaining infrastructure, which would include water and water installations where they are or would be used by the military. This is an extremely dangerous line to go down. I would note that the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, has an ongoing project about global IHL protection, and that includes looking at the definition of what is a civilian object and what is protected against attack. And I hope this particular issue, desalination plants, water purification, reservoirs, etc., is foremost in their minds, because if we allow those to be attacked, there's very little left that would be considered a civilian object. As you asked for the framework, we have two, I think, particularly important rules beyond the protection of civilian objects. One is starvation of the civilian population as a method of warfare is prohibited, but also within that, the destruction of objects that are indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. And it's hard to think of anything more fundamental than water and water facilities.
Shima, could you help us to stay grounded and continue on what this actually means for people? So what has losing that infrastructure meant for ordinary Iranians? And can you paint us the picture of what that looks like more broadly?
Yes, Iran has been dealing with water scarcity for decades. And of course, the causes are complex. There is climate change, but also excessive dam construction and poor water management. For instance, in regions such as my hometown, Isfahan, the farmers have repeatedly protested against water shortages and often faced extremely violent crackdowns. I can imagine that the water infrastructure is an attractive target for someone who is looking for destabilizing already fragile communities. And you mentioned sanctions, and I think they often function in a similar way. These measures frequently destabilize ordinary communities and increase pressure on the population in the hope that people will eventually rise against the regime themselves. But as we have repeatedly seen in Iran, the state's response to public unrest is often sheer violence. So in practice, what these policies frequently produce is simply more suffering for ordinary people. We see that the Iranian currency has lost much of its value, inflation has soared, and the purchasing power of ordinary people has dramatically declined over the past few years. At the same time, we see there has been a CIA report said that Iran managed to retain more than 70% of missiles after these military attacks. This means that basically it's people who's bearing the consequences of all of these measures. And now, as the direct and indirect consequences of the war, and as well as the more than 2 months of internet shutdowns, millions of people have lost their jobs. The economic situation has severely declined even further, and there is a serious shortage of medicine. And as always, the most vulnerable population, including migrants, laborers, women, and the marginalized ethnic communities such as Kurds and Baluchis, particularly those affected by intersecting forms of discrimination, are bearing the heaviest burden in this regard.
There's also this widespread assumption in much of the commentary that we hear now that this conflict has weakened the Iranian regime. But when it seems like when we look at what actually happened inside Iran and we listen to the voices inside Iran, what has happened since February 28th is very different. So could you tell us a bit more, Shima, about what you've heard and observed, and why do you think this picture looks so different to what's being reported?
The war may have ended, but there is still no peace for the Iranian people. And I think it is important to understand peace here in its positive sense, as many feminist scholars put it. Peace is not simply as the absence of armed conflict, but as the presence of justice, dignity, and security. And by that standard, many Iranians have not lived in peace for years. And in fact, under the cover of the war, the regime has significantly intensified repression. In just the first months of 2026, more than 600 executions were carried out. And the numbers that we know, the cases that we know. And this is the highest rate recorded within such a short period in decades. And almost every day, Iranians wake up to the news of further executions connected to the January protest, while many others remain on death row. At the same time, there have been thousands of arrests, increasing militarization of public spaces, and an intensified climate of fear and surveillance. One of the most troubling consequences of this war is that the external aggression effectively re-legitimized a government that had been facing profound domestic opposition. Nationalist sentiments intensified during this conflict, and the war provided the authorities with political cover to expand repression in the name of national security. Meanwhile, because of prolonged internet shutdown and communication restriction, large parts of the Iranian population have effectively disappeared from international visibility. While the world leaders are busy with gas and oil prices and the Strait of Hormuz, repression is intensifying in Iran, but with far less international scrutiny than before.
Thank you for your honesty and for saying that out loud. It's such a troubling picture, and I feel like it's one that most people outside Iran have no clue about. And so, Stuart, when a government intensifies its repression of its own people during and after an armed conflict, so with continued executions, more disappearances, surveillance, but we see also less international scrutiny than it would normally face, what can you tell us about international law here? What does it require?
So we need to distinguish two cases. The one is in relation to the protesters, and that remains the situation that these are crimes against humanity. People are being convicted on the basis of confessions extracted under torture. That's a serious violation of human rights law. They're being convicted on the basis of unfair trials, which is another serious violation of human rights law. So those are already continued crimes against humanity, and that process, sadly, is ongoing. Separate from that is there, as I understand it, there have been executions of individuals who are accused of spying for Israel or the United States. Now, there the situation is a little bit less certain, because given that Iran already have the death penalty in place, if these are the most serious crimes, by which we normally mean homicide, i.e. if an individual in Iran had led deliberately and inevitably to a strike on for example, a civilian object, then potentially, and I use the word very carefully, potentially that would not be a violation. In fact, it seems that this is a broad-based prosecution of espionage, and espionage in and of itself is not enough to justify the death penalty. Iran is a state party to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and it makes it very clear that the most serious crimes are only those involving deliberate homicide.
So we're recording this at a moment when the ceasefire is holding, or should I say just. So talks to the end of the war are ongoing. However, whether this becomes a lasting agreement or a collapse back into conflict, nobody knows. But I think we can already say that something's already quite clear on what this conflict has cost and about the system that was supposed to prevent it. And so, Stuart, if we look at this conflict as a whole, what should the international community have done differently? And what does all of this reveal about the gaps in the international protection system that still haven't been addressed?
The first thing is to say is nobody has won from this war. Nobody has won. The Iranians haven't won. The Iranian people haven't won. The American people, the United States haven't won. The Israeli people and Israel have not won. Everybody has lost. And that's before we think about the broader economic impact on top of the death and the destruction. This is an appalling failure in the international system. We've had a number of acts of aggression over the last 25 years, the United States against Iraq, Russia against Ukraine. This is the latest in a very sad, tragic saga. And now the question is, how do we move out of this? And what's going to be left? As Shima told us, the regime is probably more secure than it has been for some time. The fear about nuclear proliferation appears not to have been assuaged, even though that fear was probably overblown, but has not been assuaged. Regional security has not been improved, and global economic problems are only going to mount. So who has won? Well, it hasn't been anybody involved in the conflict, and it hasn't been international law, because the attack on jus ad bellum, on human rights, on international humanitarian law is deep and, I fear, systemic.
And so I would like to end this episode where we started, which is with the Iranian people. As you've just said, Stuart, and as this episode has shown, across every section, civilians, in particular Iranian civilians, have paid the price under their own government, under external strikes, and now even in the aftermath, where the world has moved on to diplomacy. So just to end, Shima, we see that the war is formally, it's on pause. But what does the horizon look like for the people of Iran? Do you see any realistic prospects of justice, of rebuilding, or of something better?
Well, I think these are extremely dark days for people inside Iran. And honestly, I don't yet know what remains of the civil society movement inside the country, or how they will be able to navigate this situation moving forward. But if international law is to remain relevant, I think we have to take these questions seriously. We cannot simply hide behind the principle of sovereignty while populations are crushed between authoritarian repressions, as well as war, sanctions, and geopolitical struggles. At the same time, we also need to critically rethink coercive measures, at least in their current form, because too often they deepen the suffering of ordinary people rather than protecting them. International law has long been criticized for being deeply state-centric, for treating states as the primary political actors while populations themselves remain in the background. I think the way forward must involve recentering people, strengthening civil society, supporting collective diplomatic action, and recognizing that the current international legal order is failing many populations in moments of crisis. When people feel abandoned both by domestic institutions and by the international systems, violence can begin to appear as the only remaining way to be seen or heard. This is something we should take very seriously. At this moment, I think we have to honestly acknowledge the failure. But at the same time, I want to hold on to hope, and I want to return to this quote from Walter Benjamin. It is only for the sake of those without hope that hope is given to us. And I think that is precisely why we must continue insisting on justice, solidarity, and the possibility of something different.
Shima and Stuart, thank you so much for joining us today. So the violations documented in this episode are tracked in detail on our conflict monitoring portal at warwatch.ch. Warwatch is produced by the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to Warwatch, a podcast from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, a joint centre of the University of Geneva and the Geneva Graduate Institute. Find us at geneva-academy.ch and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.